The sun beat down on the dusty parking lot of Westview Academy as 17-year-old Thomas Miller unloaded his creation from the back of his father's weathered pickup truck. His hands, calloused from years of farm work, moved with surprising gentleness as he adjusted the homemade satellite dish constructed from what most would consider junk. A repurposed tractor motor, salvaged computer parts, and an old satellite dish his father had found at a yard sale for $12. To the casual observer, it looked like a science project gone wrong. But to Thomas, it represented countless hours of research, trial and error, and a solution to a problem that affected every small farmer in Oakridge County. "Need a hand with that contraption?" his father asked, climbing down from the driver's seat. Robert Miller's face was tanned and lined from decades working under the open sky, a stark contrast to the well-dressed parents now emerging from luxury SUVs and sedans around them. "I've got it, Dad," Thomas replied, carefully lifting the central component of his satellite tracker. Through the windows of Westview Academy, he could see elaborate displays being set up for the regional STEM showcase, holographic interfaces, professionally printed banners, and sleek technology that probably cost more than his family's entire farm equipment. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to quiet the doubts creeping into his mind. He knew his satellite tracker worked. It had been collecting precise agricultural data for months, helping his family increase their corn yield by nearly 15%. But would anyone here see its value? Or would they just see a farm boy and playing with scrap metal? Little did Thomas know that by this time tomorrow, a NASA helicopter would be landing on his rural school's baseball field, and everything would change. But first, he would face the crushing dismissal that nearly made him give up on his dream entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Miller family farm sat on the outskirts of Oakridge, a small farming community where cornfields stretched to the horizon, and the nearest shopping mall was 45 minutes away on a good day. It wasn't the kind of place most people associated with innovation or technological advancement. The town had one traffic light, a diner that still served $5 breakfast specials, and a hardware store where the owner knew every customer by name. It was the kind of place city folks drove through on their way to somewhere else, barely slowing down enough to notice its existence. For most of his childhood, Thomas had accepted the limitations of rural life without question. His days were structured around school and farm chores, feeding livestock before dawn, attending classes at Oakridge High, and helping with whatever seasonal work needed doing until the sun went down. But something changed when Thomas turned 14. While helping his father clear out an old storage shed, he discovered a stack of dusty astronomy magazines left behind by a previous owner. Night after night, he pored over their pages by flashlight, fascinated not just by the cosmic wonders they described, but by the technology used to study them. "Mom, did you know satellites can measure soil moisture from space?" he asked one evening at dinner, his fork paused midway to his mouth. "They can detect crop health, predict weather patterns, even identify pest infestations before they become visible to the human eye." Sarah Miller smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "That's fascinating, honey. Is this for a school project?" "No, just interested," Thomas replied, already lost in thought again. What he didn't say was that he'd spent hours researching how these satellite technologies were helping large agricultural corporations optimize their operations. The data existed: weather patterns, soil conditions, crop health indicators, all orbiting hundreds of miles above their heads. But access to that information required expensive subscription services and specialized equipment far beyond what small family farms like theirs could afford. That night, staring up at the stars from the roof of their weathered barn, Thomas had what his father would later call his lightning bolt moment. If he couldn't afford to access the satellite data, Perhaps he could build something that would allow him to do it himself. The journey from idea to invention wasn't smooth or straightforward. Thomas started with virtually no knowledge of satellite communication, orbital mechanics, or advanced electronics. His high school offered basic science courses, but nothing approaching the specialized knowledge he would need. The school's ancient computer lab had internet access that moved at a glacial pace, but it was enough for Thomas to begin his research. "You're spending an awful lot of time on that computer," Miss Reynolds, the librarian, remarked one afternoon as closing time approached. "Must be some school assignment." Thomas looked up, slightly embarrassed. "Not exactly. I'm trying to learn about satellite tracking systems." To his surprise, Miss Reynolds didn't laugh or dismiss his interest. Instead, she helped him request specialized books through the county's interlibrary loan system and introduced him to free online courses from universities that offered basic engineering principles. Each small step forward came with dozens of failures. Thomas's bedroom gradually transformed into a workshop cluttered with discarded prototypes and hand-drawn diagrams. When his experiments outgrew his bedroom, he cleared a corner of the barn, setting up a workbench beneath a bare light bulb that cast long shadows as he worked late into the night. "Son, I admire your dedication," his father said one evening, finding Thomas asleep at his workbench, a soldering iron cooling beside him. "But are you sure this isn't just a pipe dream? People with million-dollar laboratories and engineering degrees work on this kind of technology." Thomas straightened, wiping a smudge of grease from his cheek. "That's just it, Dad. They're designing systems for corporate farms with massive budgets. No one's thinking about what would work for people like us." He gestured to the partially assembled tracking device. "I don't need all the fancy features and perfect precision. I just need something good enough to give us the data that matters." Robert Miller studied his son's face, recognizing the quiet determination he'd inherited from his grandfather. "Well then," he said after a moment, "I've got an old satellite dish behind the tool shed that came with the property. Been meaning to haul it to the dump for years. Might save you some trouble if it's still in decent shape." That satellite dish, rescued from its fate at the landfill, became the centerpiece of Thomas's creation. The motor from a broken grain auger provided the mechanical movement he needed, a discarded laptop donated by the high school when they upgraded. Their computer lab became the system's brain. Each component represented dozens of hours of research, adaptation, and problem-solving. By the spring of his junior year, Thomas had constructed a working prototype of his satellite tracking system. It wasn't pretty. Wires exposed in places, the base constructed from repurposed tractor parts, the interface a simple program he'd coded himself. But it worked. When properly calibrated, the dish could locate and track specific satellites as they passed overhead, capturing and translating their freely broadcast data into usable information about weather patterns, soil conditions, and crop health. "This is incredible," Sarah Miller said, watching the dish smoothly pivot to follow an invisible point in the daytime sky. "How accurate is it?" "About 98% as accurate as the commercial systems," Thomas replied, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "And it costs less than $200 to build if you use salvaged parts like I did." Word of Thomas's invention spread through Oakridge with the efficiency of a small-town gossip network. Soon, neighboring farmers were stopping by to see the Miller boys' contraption for themselves. Most approached with skepticism, but left with thoughtful expressions, particularly when Thomas showed them how his system had helped identify a developing drainage issue in the Miller's southeast field before it became visible on the surface. Mr. Jenkins, Thomas's science teacher at Oakridge High, was particularly impressed. "This is exactly the kind of practical innovation the regional STEM showcase is looking for," he said after examining the tracker. "You should enter it in this year's competition." Thomas hesitated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Regional STEM Showcase was hosted by Westview Academy, a prestigious private school whose students regularly received full scholarships to Ivy League universities. Their projects were legendary for their sophistication and polish, often developed with support from parents who worked in scientific or technological fields. I don't know, Mr. Jenkins. My tracker doesn't exactly look like something that belongs at Westview. That's precisely why it should be there, his teacher insisted. Innovation isn't just about fancy equipment and expensive materials. It's about solving real problems with the resources available. Your satellite tracker does that in a way I haven't seen before. After much encouragement from Mr. Jenkins and his parents, Thomas submitted his application to represent Oakridge High at the Regional STEM Showcase. When the acceptance email arrived, he read it 3 times before believing it was real. "They actually want to see my project," he told his parents that evening, a mixture of excitement and anxiety in his voice. "Of course they do," his mother said, wrapping him in a quick hug. "It's brilliant, just like you." His father's response was more measured, tempered by a lifetime of seeing how those from small farming communities were often perceived by outsiders. "Just remember, son, no matter what happens at that showcase, what you've built has real value to real people. Don't let anyone tell you different." As Thomas prepared for the showcase, he made improvements to his tracking system, refining its accuracy and creating a more user-friendly interface. He prepared a presentation that explained not just how the system worked, but why it mattered, how democratizing access to agricultural satellite data could help small farms compete in an increasingly challenging economic landscape. The night before the showcase, Thomas stayed up late making final adjustments to his project. Through his bedroom window, he could see stars dotting the clear spring sky, distant satellites among them, transmitting data that most small farmers couldn't access. By this time tomorrow, he thought, the judges at Westview would have seen that it didn't have to be that way. As the miller's pickup truck pulled into Westview Academy's manicured campus, Thomas felt the full weight of the differences between this world and his own. The school looked more like a small college than a high school, with its brick buildings and carefully landscaped grounds. Luxury cars filled the parking lot, and students in designer clothes carried projects that looked professionally manufactured. "Remember what I said," Robert Miller told his son as they unloaded the satellite tracker. "No matter what happens today, you've built something valuable." Thomas nodded, swallowing against the sudden dryness in his throat. "Thanks for bringing me, Dad. I can handle it from here if you want to get back to the farm." "You sure?" "I'm happy to stay. I'm sure. The fertilizer delivery is coming this afternoon, and someone needs to be there to sign for it." As his father's truck disappeared down the long driveway, Thomas wheeled his creation toward Westview Academy's exhibition hall. He couldn't know that in less than 24 hours, NASA officials would be examining his invention with professional interest, or that a helicopter bearing their insignia would land on Oakridge High's baseball field. He couldn't know that. His life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. All he knew was that he believed in what he had built, even if no one else at Westview would. And for now, that would have to be enough. The exhibition hall buzzed with activity as students made final adjustments to their displays. Thomas found his assigned space, a small table in the far corner, as far from the entrance as possible. Around him, Westview students had set up elaborate displays with digital interfaces, professional signage, and in one case, a small robot that moved between visitors offering explanations of the project. Thomas carefully positioned his satellite tracker, setting up the laptop that controlled it and making sure the dish could rotate freely without hitting anything. His hand-painted sign reading "Affordable Satellite Tracking System for Agricultural" Applications looked painfully amateurish next to the glossy banners surrounding him. "What's that supposed to be?" asked a voice beside him. Thomas looked up to see a tall boy in expensive-looking clothes eyeing his project with undisguised skepticism. "Some kind of homemade radar?" "It's a satellite tracking system," Thomas replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "It locates and follows specific satellites to collect agricultural data." The boy raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? You know my dad's company manufactures professional satellite communication systems, right? They cost about $50,000 and don't look like they were built from a junkyard." "That's kind of the point," Thomas said. "Most farmers can't afford $50,000 for satellite data. My system costs less than $200 to build." "Good luck with that," the boy snorted, walking away. "I'm sure the judges will be super impressed by your discount approach to aerospace engineering." Thomas felt his face flush, but focused on making final adjustments to his display. He reminded himself that he hadn't built his tracker to win competitions or impress people like that boy. He'd built it to solve a real problem for real people. Across the hall, he could see what must be the boy's project, a quantum computing simulation with a holographic display that drew crowds of admiring visitors. The sign identified its creator as Michael Anderson, son of Catherine Anderson, CEO of Quantum Dynamics International. As the morning progressed, judges began making their rounds, starting with the prominently placed projects in the center of the room. Thomas watched as they lingered at Michael's display, nodding appreciatively as he demonstrated his simulation. The judges moved methodically outward, spending progressively less time at each display as they approached the edges of the hall. By the time Mr. Peterson, Westview's science director and lead judge, reached Thomas's corner, his expression already showed signs of fatigue and disinterest. He glanced at the hand-painted sign, then at the assembly of repurposed parts that made up the satellite tracker. "Mr. Miller, I presume," he said, consulting his clipboard. "Please explain what we're looking at here." Thomas took a deep breath and launched into his prepared explanation, describing how he had constructed a functional satellite tracking system from salvaged components. He demonstrated how the dish could locate and follow specific satellites, and how his interface translated the collected data into usable information for agricultural applications. As he spoke, he could see Mr. Peterson's expression shifting from disinterest to something closer to disbelief. Not the good kind of disbelief that came with positive surprise, but the skeptical kind that suggested he thought Thomas was exaggerating his system's capabilities. "And you've constructed this from farm equipment?" Mr. Peterson asked, eyeing the repurposed tractor parts that formed the base of the tracking system. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, trying to infuse his voice with confidence. "The base is from an old tractor part. The motor came from a discarded grain auger, and I reprogrammed this salvaged computer to calculate orbital trajectories. The entire system costs less than $200 to build, which makes it accessible to small farmers who can't afford commercial satellite data services." Mr. Peterson made a note on his clipboard, his mouth tightening into a thin line. "And what research did you reference in developing this device?" "I studied orbital mechanics through online courses from MIT's OpenCourseWare," Thomas explained. "The tracking algorithm is adapted from open-source astronomy software, and I research satellite communication protocols through NASA's public database. I also incorporated practical knowledge from farmers about what specific data would be most useful for agricultural applications." At the mention of farmer knowledge, Mr. Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly, and Thomas noticed several nearby Westview students exchange smirks. "Mr. Miller," Mr. Peterson said, his tone shifting to one of condescension thinly veiled as academic concern. STEM competitions of this caliber typically showcase innovations based on established scientific methodologies and contemporary technologies, not cobbled-together farm equipment. Thomas felt his stomach tighten, but he pressed on. The system has a 98.3% accuracy rate compared to commercial systems costing thousands of dollars. The data translation algorithm actually processes certain agricultural metrics more efficiently than standard approaches because it's specifically optimized for... Perhaps in Oakridge this qualifies as innovation, Mr. Peterson interrupted. But at Westview, we expect projects that advance scientific fields, not repurpose scrap metal. This looks more like a 4-H project than serious engineering. Laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered around Thomas's table, attracted by Mr. Peterson's dismissive tone. Thomas felt heat rising to his face, but forced himself to remain composed. The purpose of innovation is to solve problems, he said quietly. This solves a real problem for small farmers who need access to data they currently can't afford. Mr. Peterson handed back Thomas's project information sheet without looking at it. You might consider leaving satellite technology to NASA and focusing on something more appropriate to your background. He turned to move to the next display, adding over his shoulder, "Though I appreciate your rustic approach." More laughter followed as Mr. Peterson walked away. Thomas stood frozen beside his creation, the excitement and pride he'd felt that morning replaced by a hollow sensation in his chest. 600 hours of work, countless late nights, and all the knowledge he'd taught himself, dismissed in less than 5 minutes because his innovation didn't look like what Mr. Peterson expected. "Don't take it personally, farm boy," said Michael Anderson, who had wandered over during the judging. "Not everyone can afford quantum computing equipment. Your little dish thing is cute in a retro way." Thomas said nothing, focusing on adjusting a connection on his tracker that didn't actually need adjusting. He just needed something to do with his hands while he processed what had happened. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas found himself alone in his corner of the exhibition hall. The satellite tracker, which had seemed so significant on the farm, now looked out of place and inadequate among the sophisticated projects surrounding it. For the first time since he'd begun working on it, Thomas wondered if his father had been right that first night in the barn. Maybe this was just a farm boy's pipe dream. He ran his hand along the satellite dish, remembering the day he and his father had rescued it from behind the tool shed, how they'd spent hours cleaning and repairing it. Each component of his creation represented countless hours of research, trial and error, and late nights in the barn after farm chores were done. Thomas had taught himself advanced physics, electronics, and programming to bring his vision to life. And now, all that work had been dismissed with a condescending smile and a recommendation to stick to something more appropriate to his background. Thomas began packing up his project, carefully disconnecting the components and wrapping them in the old blankets he'd brought for transport. There was no point staying for the awards ceremony later that afternoon. The judges had made their opinion of his work clear enough. "Excuse me," said a voice behind him. "Are you leaving already?" Thomas turned to find an older woman watching him with a thoughtful expression. Unlike most of the well-dressed staff members he'd seen at Westview, she wore simple clothes and carried a worn leather bag over her shoulder. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, continuing to wrap his satellite dish. "I think I've seen enough." "I couldn't help overhearing your presentation," the woman said. "Would you mind showing me how your tracking system works before you pack it away?" Thomas hesitated, suspecting some kind of trap or further mockery, but something in the woman's expression seemed genuinely interested. With a small sigh, he reconnected the power source and fired up the laptop control system. "This interface allows you to select which satellite you want to track," he explained, gradually regaining some of his earlier enthusiasm as he demonstrated the system. Once you choose one, the system calculates its orbit and positions the dish accordingly. Then this program translates the raw data into usable information like soil moisture levels or weather patterns. The woman nodded thoughtfully, asking detailed questions about the tracking algorithm and data processing methods that revealed a surprising knowledge of satellite communications. As Thomas answered, he found himself forgetting the sting of Mr. Peterson's dismissal, focusing instead on the technical aspects of his creation. "My name is Dr. Susan Williams," the woman said when he finished his demonstration. "I'm the library media specialist here at Westview, but before that, I worked in telecommunications engineering." "Oh," Thomas said, surprised. "You seem to know a lot about satellite systems." Dr. Williams smiled. "Enough to recognize that what you've built here is quite remarkable. The commercial systems I'm familiar with cost thousands of dollars and require specialized training to operate. You've created something that achieves comparable results at a fraction of the cost, with an interface simple enough for anyone to use." Thomas felt a small flicker of pride rekindling. That was the goal. Most farmers can't afford expensive technology, but they still need the data. "You know," Dr. Williams said thoughtfully, "true innovation often comes from understanding real needs, not just applying new technology for its own sake. Your approach, working within severe constraints to solve a practical problem, that's exactly the kind of thinking that drives some of the most important advancements in engineering." She took out her phone and snapped several photos of the satellite tracker from different angles. "Would you mind if I shared information about your project with some colleagues who might appreciate your approach?" "I guess not," Thomas replied, though the judges didn't seem very impressed. "Different people recognize different kinds of value, Thomas," Dr. Williams said, her expression turning slightly amused. "Don't let one person's opinion diminish what you've accomplished here." As Thomas finished packing up his project, Dr. Williams helped him wheel it to the exit. "Keep developing these ideas," she said as they parted. "The world needs more problem solvers who understand both technical possibilities and practical constraints." Thomas nodded his thanks, but as he loaded his satellite tracker into his mother's car, she had come to pick him up after finishing her shift at the local clinic. He couldn't help feeling that Dr. Williams's encouragement, while kind, wouldn't change the fundamental reality. In the world of high-tech innovation, a farm boy with salvaged parts didn't stand a chance against quantum computers and corporate connections. "How did it go?" his mother asked, as they pulled away from Westview's imposing campus. Thomas stared out the window at the manicured grounds receding behind them. "About as well as you'd expect," he said quietly. "Turns out that science competitions don't put much value on making technology accessible to farmers." Sarah Miller reached over to squeeze her son's hand. "I'm sorry, honey. For what it's worth, your father and I are incredibly proud of what you've built, regardless of what some competition judges think." Thomas managed a small smile, but inside he couldn't help wondering if all those hours in the barn had been wasted. As they drove through the gates of Westview Academy, he had no way of knowing that Dr. Susan Williams was already making a phone call that would change everything, or that in less than 24 hours, a NASA helicopter would be landing on his school's baseball field because of the very project that Mr. Peterson had dismissed as a 4-H project, unworthy of serious consideration. The drive back to Oakridge felt longer than the morning journey had. Thomas sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching as the manicured suburbs gave way to open farmland. Fields of early spring wheat rippled in the afternoon breeze. The same fields that would benefit from the data his satellite tracker could provide. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Do you want to talk about it?" his mother asked, breaking the silence. Thomas sighed. "There's not much to say. Mr. Peterson, that's the head judge, basically said my project was junk, called it a 4-H project, rather than serious engineering. Sarah's knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel. That's not right. He should have judged your work on its merits, not on how it looks. I think that's the problem, Mom. To them, the merits are about theoretical innovation and fancy technology. They don't care about solving real problems for people like us. Woo. He gazed out at the passing farms. One judge actually told me to leave satellite technology to NASA and focus on something more appropriate to my background. What does that even mean? Sarah asked, indignation clear in her voice. I think it means stick to shoveling manure and driving tractors, Thomas replied, the bitterness he'd been suppressing finally showing through. Apparently, farm kids aren't supposed to reach for the stars. Sarah pulled the car over to the shoulder, putting it in park and turning to face her son directly. Thomas Miller, I want you to listen to me carefully. That man doesn't know you. He doesn't know the hours you've spent learning orbital mechanics and programming languages. He doesn't know how you figured out how to repurpose that old satellite dish when everyone said it couldn't be done. She took her son's hand. And most importantly, he doesn't get to decide what's appropriate for your background or what you're capable of achieving. Thomas felt a lump forming in his throat. His mother rarely spoke with such intensity. I know it hurts to have your work dismissed, she continued more gently. But what you built works. It solves a real problem, and no competition judge can take that away from you. Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Thanks, Mom, he finally managed. They drove the rest of the way home in a more comfortable silence. As they turned onto the gravel road leading to the Miller farm, Thomas could see his father's figure in the south field, checking the irrigation system. The familiar sight helped ground him, reminding him why he'd built the satellite tracker in the first place. The farm wasn't just land and crops to the Millers, it was a legacy spanning 4 generations, each one fighting increasingly difficult economic odds to keep the operation viable. Thomas's innovation hadn't been created for a competition or to impress judges. It had been born from the very real challenge of helping his family farm more efficiently with limited resources. I'll help Dad with the irrigation check, Thomas said as they pulled up to the house. Can you tell him I'll be out in a few minutes? I just want to get the tracker stored in the barn. Sarah nodded, understanding her son's need for a moment alone. Of course. Dinner will be ready at 6. Thomas carefully unloaded his satellite tracker from the car, wheeling it toward the weathered red barn that had served as his workshop. For the past year, inside, the familiar smell of hay and machine oil greeted him, so different from the antiseptic cleanliness of Westview Academy. He placed his creation in the corner of his makeshift workshop, removing the protective blankets and reconnecting the power supply almost automatically. The dish pivoted smoothly as the system booted up, searching for its programmed satellite. Thomas watched it work, the graceful movement belying the cobbled-together nature of its components. Mr. Peterson had been right about one thing. It didn't look impressive. The exposed wiring, the mismatched parts, the interface running on a salvaged laptop, none of it screamed cutting-edge technology. But it worked. It tracked satellites with 3% accuracy compared to systems costing 100 times more. It processed data in ways specifically optimized for agricultural applications. It made valuable information accessible to people who couldn't afford commercial alternatives. Thomas sat heavily on his workshop stool, the events of the day washing over him in waves, the excitement of the morning, the anticipation as he'd set up his display, the crushing dismissal from Mr. Peterson, the unexpected encouragement from Dr. Williams, and now the hollow uncertainty of what to do next. He'd been so certain that if people just saw what his tracker could do, they would recognize its value. He'd imagined interest from agricultural schools, maybe even companies, wanting to develop his design for wider distribution. Instead, he'd been laughed out of the competition, told to stay in his lane. Thomas opened his notebook, flipping through pages of calculations, circuit diagrams, and code snippets. Each page represented a problem solved, a hurdle overcome. For a moment, he considered closing the book for good, accepting that his ambitions had reached their limit. What was the point of continuing if no one in the scientific community would take his work seriously? But as he reached the final page of notes, his eyes fell on a quote he'd scrawled in the margin months ago. "Innovation is seeing what everybody has seen and thinking what nobody has thought." He'd come across it during his research and written it down as a reminder of what he was trying to accomplish. Thomas ran his fingers over the words, remembering the moment when he'd first realized he could build a satellite tracker from salvaged parts, how impossible it had seemed, and how satisfying it had felt when the system finally worked correctly. That satisfaction hadn't come from external validation. It had come from solving a problem everyone said couldn't be solved with the resources available. Outside, he could hear his father calling his name. With a deep breath, Thomas closed his notebook and stood up. Tomorrow, he would decide whether to continue developing his tracker or channel his energy elsewhere. For now, there was work to be done on the farm, real, tangible work that put food on tables and paid the bills. In many ways, that was what mattered most, regardless of what the scientific community thought of his innovation. "Coming, Dad," he called, heading for the barn door. Whatever happened next, the fields wouldn't wait. Thomas spent the evening helping his father with farm chores, grateful for the physical work that left little room for dwelling on the day's disappointments. They checked irrigation lines, repaired a section of fence damaged in the last storm, and discussed plans for the upcoming planting season. Robert Miller didn't press his son for details about the competition, sensing that Thomas needed space to process the experience in his own way. As they walked back to the house for dinner, however, Robert finally broached the subject. "Your mother mentioned it didn't go so well at Westview." Thomas nodded, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "The judge said my tracker was more appropriate for a 4-H show than a serious competition. Called it cobbled-together farm equipment instead of real innovation." His father was quiet for a moment, digesting this information. "You know," he finally said, "your grandfather used to say that people who've never had to solve problems with limited resources don't understand the kind of innovation that necessity creates." Thomas glanced at his father, surprised by the insight. "When we had that drought 3 summers back," Robert continued, "and every irrigation expert in the county said we'd lose half our crops unless we spent money we didn't have on new equipment, your grandfather rigged up that modified distribution system everyone said wouldn't work. But it did work," Thomas said, remembering. "Better than anyone expected." "Exactly, and now half the farms in the county use some version of it." Robert put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Innovation isn't defined by how fancy it looks or how much it costs to build. It's defined by whether it solves a real problem in a way that works for the people who need it." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest at his father's words. It wasn't just parental comfort. It was a fundamental truth about innovation that the judges at Westview had missed entirely. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. Robert squeezed his son's shoulder. "Your tracker works, Thomas. It helps us farm more efficiently with information we couldn't otherwise afford. Don't let anyone tell you that's not valuable." They entered the house to the smell of Sarah's pot roast, a special meal she'd prepared in anticipation of celebrating Thomas's success at the competition. Though the celebration had turned to consolation, the familiarity of the family dinner ritual brought Thomas a measure of comfort. As they ate, Thomas gradually shared more details about his day, including Dr. Williams's unexpected interest in his project. She used to work in telecommunications engineering before becoming the school librarian, he explained. She seemed to actually understand what I was trying to accomplish with the tracker. "It's good someone there recognized your work," Sarah said, passing the mashed potatoes. "Though it should have been the judges." "She took pictures and asked if she could share information about it with some colleagues," Thomas added. "Not that it'll lead to anything." "You never know," Robert replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes the right person seeing your work can make all the difference." After dinner, Thomas helped clear the table and wash dishes before retreating to his room. The emotional and physical exhaustion of the day caught up with him quickly, and he fell asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. Hours later, Thomas was jolted awake by the sound of his phone buzzing on his nightstand. Blinking groggily, he reached for it, expecting a text from Alex, his best friend who'd want to know how the competition went. Instead, he found himself staring at an email notification from an unfamiliar address. Jim Martinez NASA, Goves. Suddenly wide awake, Thomas sat up, reading the subject line. "Your satellite tracking system, request for demonstration." For a moment, he was certain he was still dreaming. NASA emailing him about his satellite tracker? It had to be a prank, probably orchestrated by Michael Anderson or one of the other Westview students who'd laughed at his project. With wary curiosity, Thomas opened the email, prepared for some elaborate joke at his expense. Instead, he found himself reading what appeared to be a genuine message from Dr. Jennifer Martinez, identified as the lead communications engineer at NASA's Rural Technology Initiative. "Dear Mr. Miller," the email began, "your innovative approach to satellite tracking and data processing was brought to my attention by my aunt, Dr. Susan Williams. I was particularly impressed by your ability to create a functional system using repurposed components at a fraction of the cost of commercial alternatives, while maintaining a high degree of accuracy." Thomas blinked, rereading the opening paragraph. Dr. Williams was this NASA engineer's aunt? That explained her knowledge of satellite communications and her interest in his project. The email continued. "At NASA's Rural Technology Initiative, we are currently developing communication systems for agricultural and environmental monitoring in remote areas where traditional infrastructure is limited or non-existent. Your approach to satellite tracking using readily available components has potential applications for our work." Thomas's heart began to race as he read on. "I would be interested in seeing your system in operation and discussing your design process. As it happens, I will be in your area tomorrow for a previously scheduled visit to a research facility. Would it be possible for my team and me to visit your school, Oakridge High, around noon to view your project? Please let me know at your earliest convenience." The email concluded with Dr. Martinez's contact information and NASA credentials, along with a request for Thomas to respond as soon as possible to confirm the meeting. Thomas stared at his phone, reading and rereading the message, looking for signs that it might be fake. The email address appeared legitimate, ending in the official NASA Gov domain. The language was professional and specific to his project. Dr. Martinez mentioned details about his tracker that only someone who had seen Dr. Williams's photos would know. Could this possibly be real? A NASA engineer wanted to see his satellite tracker, the same cobbled-together farm equipment that Mr. Peterson had dismissed as unworthy of serious consideration. Thomas glanced at the time. 11:47 p.m. Too late to wake his parents for advice, but this required an immediate response. He took a deep breath and composed a careful reply, thanking Dr. Martinez for her interest and confirming that he would be at school the following day. He provided his contact information and explained that he would need to arrange for permission to demonstrate his project, as it was currently stored at his family's farm. After reading over his response several times, Thomas hit send, still, half convinced he was participating in an elaborate prank. Then, to his surprise, a reply came almost immediately. Thank you for your prompt response, Thomas. I look forward to meeting you tomorrow at Oakridge High. We'll plan to arrive at noon. Don't worry about transporting your entire system. We'd like to see your design documents and discuss your approach first. If things proceed as I hope, we can arrange to view the complete system afterward. Sleep well. Dr. Jennifer Martinez. Thomas placed his phone back on the nightstand with shaking hands. If this was real, and it was looking increasingly like it might be, then tomorrow could change everything. A NASA engineer was coming to his school specifically to see his project. The same project that had been laughed out of the Westview competition just hours ago. Sleep seemed impossible now, but Thomas knew he needed rest if he was going to be at his best tomorrow. He lay back down, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars he'd stuck to his ceiling as a child, his mind racing with questions. What would Dr. Martinez ask about his tracker? What aspects of his design had interested her? And most importantly, was this really happening? As he finally drifted towards sleep, one thought kept circling in his mind. Mr. Peterson had told him to leave satellite technology to NASA. It seemed NASA might have other ideas. The Miller family breakfast table was unusually quiet the next morning. Thomas had shared the late-night email with his parents, showing them the NASA credentials and contact information that suggested this wasn't an elaborate prank. Yet a lingering skepticism kept their excitement in check. "I still think we should be prepared for disappointment," Robert Miller said, spreading butter on his toast. "Not saying it's a hoax, but government folks are notorious for changing plans at the last minute." Sarah refilled his coffee cup. Whether they show up or not, the fact that someone from NASA even expressed interest is something to be proud of. Thomas nodded absently, checking his phone for the dozenth time since waking. No new messages from Dr. Martinez, no cancellation, no indication that this was anything but legitimate. He'd already informed Principal Evans about the potential visit, and despite the principal's obvious skepticism, arrangements had been made to accommodate NASA representatives should they actually appear. "I should get going," Thomas said, rising from the table. "If they're really coming at noon, I want to. Make sure everything's ready." His father nodded. "I'll load your tracker into the truck. If this Dr. Martinez wants to see it after meeting you at school, I can bring it over." "Thanks, Dad." Thomas hesitated at the door. "Even if this turns out to be nothing, I'm going to keep working on the system. Mr. Peterson was wrong about it not being real innovation." Robert's weathered face broke into a rare, full smile. "That's my boy. Now go show NASA what Oakridge ingenuity looks like." The drive to school was filled with nervous anticipation. Thomas had chosen his clothes carefully. The same button-down shirt and cleanest jeans he'd worn to the competition, not fancy by Westview standards, but the best he had. He'd spent the early morning hours organizing his design notes and preparing to answer technical questions about his tracking system's operation. Oakridge High School looked exactly as it always did. A modest brick building surrounded by athletic fields, the American flag hanging limply in the still morning air. Nothing about its appearance suggested it might soon host visitors from one of the world's premier space agencies. Thomas made his way through the crowded hallways, dodging the usual mixture of indifference and friendly greetings from classmates who had no idea what might be happening in a few hours. "Heard your science. Fair thing didn't go so well," Alex said, falling into step beside Thomas as they headed to first period English. Alex had been Thomas's best friend since elementary school, one of the few people who had taken his satellite tracker seriously from the beginning. "You could say that," Thomas replied, lowering his voice. "But something weird happened afterward. I got an email from NASA last night." Alex stopped walking, forcing a freshman to swerve around him. "You got what?" Thomas pulled him aside, away from the flow of students. "A NASA engineer emailed me about my tracker. She's supposedly coming here at noon today to see it." "Are you serious? NASA? Here?" Alex's voice rose with each question, drawing curious glances from passing students. "Keep it down," Thomas hissed. "It might be nothing, could be a prank or a miscommunication. But if it's real, then Mr. Peterson and everyone at Westview who laughed at my farm boy science project are going to be eating their words," Thomas finished, allowing himself a small smile at the thought. The morning dragged by with excruciating slowness. Thomas couldn't focus on his classes, his mind constantly returning to the email and the approaching noon hour. By fourth period, rumors had begun circulating through the school about possible NASA visitors, though most students assumed it was connected to the upcoming career day rather than to Thomas's project. At 11:45, Principal Evans called Thomas to the office, his expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "I just received a call from Dr. Jennifer Martinez," he said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "She confirmed that she and 2 colleagues will be arriving at noon to meet with you about your satellite tracking project." Thomas felt his heart leap. "So it's real? They're actually coming?" "Apparently so," Principal Evans replied, looking slightly dazed. "I've arranged for you to use the conference room off the main office for your meeting. Your science teacher, Mr. Jenkins, will be joining you as a faculty representative." "Thank you, sir." Principal Evans adjusted his tie nervously. "Thomas, I don't need to tell you what an unusual opportunity this is for Oakridge High. NASA doesn't typically send representatives to rural schools to meet with students. No, sir. Whatever impressed them about your project, make the most of this meeting." He checked his watch. "They should be arriving in about 10 minutes. Why don't you get your materials set up in the conference room?" Thomas hurried to gather his design notebooks and laptop from his locker. As he entered the small conference room, he found Mr. Jenkins already waiting, his excitement barely contained. "Thomas, this is extraordinary," the science teacher said, helping him arrange his materials on the conference table. "I knew your tracker was impressive, but to attract NASA's attention, that's beyond anything I imagined when I encouraged you to enter the competition." "I'm still not entirely convinced it's real," Thomas admitted, setting up his laptop to display the tracker's interface. "Seems too good to be true after yesterday." Mr. Jenkins placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the right people recognize value that others miss. From what you've told me about this Dr. Martinez, her background gives her a unique perspective on your work." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion in the main office drew their attention. Through the conference room's glass wall, they could see Principal Evans hurrying toward the main entrance, straightening his jacket as he went. A moment later, he returned, accompanied by 3 people wearing navy blue jackets with the NASA insignia clearly visible on the breast pocket. Thomas felt his mouth go dry as Principal Evans opened the conference room door. "Thomas, Mr. Jenkins, may I introduce Dr. Jennifer Martinez, Dr. James Wilson, and Dr. Aisha Patel from NASA's Rural Technology Initiative." Dr. Martinez stepped forward first, extending her hand. She was tall, with dark hair streaked with silver, and her firm handshake conveyed confidence without intimidation. "You must be Thomas Miller. Thank you for accommodating us on such short notice." Thomas shook her hand, finding his voice. "It's an honor to meet you, Dr. Martinez. I still can't believe you're actually here." She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "When my aunt sent me those photos of your satellite tracker, I knew we needed to see it for ourselves. This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking our initiative was established to identify and support." Dr. Wilson, a lean man with salt and pepper hair, and Dr. Patel, a younger woman with bright, inquisitive eyes, introduced themselves in turn, each expressing genuine interest in Thomas's project. Principal Evans and Mr. Jenkins remained in the background, exchanging astonished glances as the NASA team took seats around the conference table, focusing their complete attention on Thomas. So, Dr. Martinez began, tell us about your satellite tracking system. What inspired you to build it? Thomas took a deep breath, his nervousness fading as he began to explain the origins of his project. He described how he'd realized that satellite data could help small farmers like his family compete with larger operations, but the commercial systems were prohibitively expensive. He explained the technical challenges he'd faced in building a functional tracker from salvaged components, and the solutions he'd developed through research and experimentation. As he spoke, the NASA engineers listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances or nodding with approval. Dr. Wilson took notes, while Dr. Patel asked detailed questions about Thomas's tracking algorithm and data processing approach. The most challenging part, Thomas explained, bringing up diagrams on his laptop, was developing a tracking system accurate enough to maintain a lock on moving satellites without expensive motors or precision components. I adapted a technique from astronomical tracking telescopes, using a predictive algorithm that compensates for mechanical imprecisions in the drive system. Dr. Patel leaned forward, clearly impressed. That's a remarkably elegant solution. And you implemented this yourself? Yes, ma'am. I studied orbital mechanics through MIT's online courses and modified open-source astronomy software to work with my hardware constraints. Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what caught my attention in the photos my aunt sent. You've essentially created a low-cost, high-efficiency satellite communications system using repurposed materials and clever engineering workarounds. She opened her tablet and turned it to face Thomas. We're currently developing communication systems for rural and remote areas globally. The commercial systems cost too much for widespread adoption in developing regions. Your approach offers a potential solution we hadn't considered. Thomas stared at the screen, which showed a NASA project developing satellite communication systems for agricultural monitoring in regions with limited infrastructure. The parallels to his own project were unmistakable, though the NASA system used expensive, custom-built components. The primary barrier to implementing our system in developing regions is cost, Dr. Wilson explained. We've been approaching the problem from a traditional engineering perspective, how to reduce the cost of high-precision components. But your solution approaches it differently, how to achieve comparable results using readily available, low-cost materials. That's exactly what I was going for, Thomas said, excitement building in his voice. Small farmers can't afford $50,000 systems, but they still need the data. My tracker provides about 98% of the functionality at less than 5% of the cost. Dr. Martinez exchanged glances with her colleagues, a silent communication passing between them. Thomas, we'd very much like to see your actual system in operation. I understand it's at your farm. Yes, ma'am. My dad's on standby to bring it over if you're interested. Definitely interested, Dr. Martinez confirmed. Could you call him now? As Thomas stepped out to call his father, Principal Evans approached the NASA team, his expression still registering disbelief. I must say, we're extremely honored by your visit to Oakridge High. It's not often that rural schools like ours receive attention from institutions like NASA. Dr. Martinez smiled diplomatically. Our Rural Technology Initiative specifically focuses on identifying innovations that emerge from non-traditional sources. Some of the most creative solutions come from people who understand real-world constraints firsthand. Of course, Principal Evans nodded rapidly. We've always encouraged our students to think outside the box. Thomas's project is a perfect example of the kind of practical innovation we foster here. Mr. Jenkins raised an eyebrow but said, "Nothing," knowing that until yesterday, no one at Oakridge High except himself had paid much attention to Thomas's satellite tracker. Thomas returned to the conference room. "My dad's on his way with the tracker. He should be here in about 15 minutes. "Excellent. Dr. Martinez replied. "While we wait, I'd like to hear more about the data processing side of your system. How did you optimize it specifically for agricultural applications?" Thomas pulled up his code on the laptop, explaining how he'd developed algorithms to extract and process the specific data points most relevant to farming: soil moisture levels, crop health indicators, and short-term weather patterns. The NASA team listened attentively, occasionally exchanging technical observations that confirmed they understood and valued the sophistication of Thomas's work. Dr. Patel pointed to a section of code. "This is a very clever approach to data filtering. Did you develop this yourself?" "Yes, ma'am. The standard algorithms were designed for scientific applications with different priorities. I needed something that would prioritize the data points most useful for day-to-day farming decisions." Dr. Wilson nodded appreciatively. "That's what makes your system so valuable, Thomas. You haven't just built a cheaper version of existing technology. You've optimized it for a specific use case in ways that expensive commercial systems don't address." A commotion outside the window drew their attention. Students were gathering on the lawn, pointing toward the parking lot, where Robert Miller's pickup truck had just arrived with the satellite tracker secured in the bed. "Shall we go outside?" Dr. Martinez suggested. "I think we'd all like to see your system in operation." The group moved outside, followed by an increasingly large crowd of curious students and teachers who had heard rumors about NASA visitors. Thomas helped his father unload the satellite tracker, setting it up on the lawn in front of the school. Robert Miller stood back, his weathered face a mixture of pride and amazement as NASA engineers gathered around his son's creation. "This motor came from a grain auger?" Dr. Wilson asked, examining the tracking system's mechanical components. "Yes, sir," Thomas confirmed. "It wasn't precise enough for satellite tracking in its original form, but I modified it with this gear reduction system and added the feedback mechanism to compensate for mechanical imprecisions." Dr. Patel crouched to examine the electronic components. "And these processing units are from recycled computers, mostly from old laptops the school was discarding. They're not powerful by current standards, but they're more than adequate for the calculations needed." As Thomas powered up the system, the satellite dish began to move smoothly, searching for its programmed target. The gathered crowd watched in silence as the dish locked onto a point in the clear blue sky, then began the subtle adjustments needed to track the satellite's movement. "Remarkable," Dr. Martinez murmured, checking the tracking accuracy against a handheld device of her own. "It's maintaining lock with 98.4% accuracy compared to our reference system." Thomas pulled up the data interface on his laptop, showing how the system translated the satellite's raw data into usable information about soil moisture, crop health, and weather patterns. The specificity of the information, tailored to agricultural needs, clearly impressed the NASA team. Dr. Martinez turned to her colleagues, another silent exchange passing between them before she addressed Thomas directly. "Thomas, what you've created here is exactly the kind of innovation our initiative was established to find. You've approached a complex technical challenge from a completely different perspective than our engineers, and in doing so, you've developed solutions we hadn't considered." Thomas felt a surge of pride, stronger than anything he'd experienced at the Westview competition. This wasn't patronizing encouragement. It was professional recognition from experts who genuinely understood the value of his work. "Thank you," he managed, suddenly aware of the crowd of students and teachers watching the exchange with growing amazement. "We'd like to invite you to participate in our Rural Technology Symposium next month at the Johnson Space Center," Dr. Martinez continued. "Your satellite tracker represents an approach to low-cost communication systems that could have significant applications in developing regions worldwide." A murmur ran through the crowd. NASA was inviting Thomas Miller, the same Thomas Miller who sat at the back of most classes, whose family had farmed the same land for generations, to present at Johnson Space Center. The symposium brings together engineers, researchers, and innovators working on technologies for rural and remote communities, Dr. Wilson added. Your perspective would be extremely valuable to our work. All expenses would be covered, of course, Dr. Martinez clarified. And we'd like to discuss the possibility of you consulting with our team on adapting your approach for our global initiatives. Thomas stood speechless, unable to fully process what was happening. His father stepped forward, extending his hand to Dr. Martinez. I'm Robert Miller, Thomas's father. This is an incredible opportunity you're offering my son. Dr. Martinez shook his hand warmly. Your son has created something remarkable, Mr. Miller. The kind of practical innovation that comes from understanding real-world problems firsthand is exactly what our initiative needs. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted the conversation as another vehicle pulled into the parking lot, a sleek black sedan that seemed out of place at Oakridge High. All eyes turned as the car stopped, and a familiar figure emerged. Mr. Peterson, the Westview science director who had dismissed Thomas's project just yesterday. Thomas watched with a mixture of surprise and vindication as Mr. Peterson approached the group, his expression conveying barely contained astonishment at the scene before him. NASA engineers examining the 4-H project he had so casually dismissed, surrounded by impressed Oakridge students and faculty. Principal Evans stepped forward to greet him. Mr. Peterson, what an unexpected pleasure. What brings you to Oakridge High? Mr. Peterson straightened his tie nervously. Word reached Westview about NASA visitors at Oakridge. I wanted to follow up on Thomas's project, given our conversation yesterday. Dr. Martinez turned, her eyebrow raising slightly. Mr. Peterson, from Westview Academy, Thomas mentioned your science competition yesterday. Yes, that's right, Mr. Peterson confirmed, extending his hand with a forced smile. I was one of the judges who had the pleasure of reviewing Thomas's fascinating project. Thomas caught the subtle emphasis on pleasure and fascinating, words that had definitely not been part of Mr. Peterson's assessment yesterday. He met the teacher's eyes briefly, noting the discomfort there, but said nothing. How fortunate, Dr. Martinez replied, her tone neutral but her eyes evaluating. Thomas was just demonstrating his satellite tracking system for us. We've invited him to present at our Rural Technology Symposium at Johnson Space Center next month. Mr. Peterson's eyes widened slightly. Johnson Space Center? That's quite an honor. We at Westview are very proud of Thomas's achievement. The disconnect between this statement and yesterday's dismissal was so stark that several Oakridge students who had heard about the Westview competition exchanged meaningful glances. Thomas felt no satisfaction in Mr. Peterson's discomfort, only a quiet certainty that his project's value had never depended on the science director's opinion. Dr. Martinez turned back to Thomas, effectively dismissing Mr. Peterson from her attention. Now, about the symposium. We'll send formal details by email, but the event is scheduled for the 15th through the 17th of next month. Would that work? With your school schedule? Principal Evans stepped forward quickly. Oakridge High would be happy to make any necessary accommodations for this extraordinary opportunity. Excellent, Dr. Martinez smiled. And we'd like to arrange a visit to your farm next week, if possible, to see how your system operates in its intended environment. Our team is particularly interested in the real-world agricultural applications you've developed. As the NASA team began discussing logistics with Thomas and his father, Mr. Peterson hovered at the edge of the group, clearly unsure of his place in this unexpected scenario. Finally, he approached Thomas directly. Thomas, I want to congratulate you on this remarkable recognition. he said, lowering his voice. "I may have been hasty in my assessment yesterday. Your project clearly has merits I failed to fully appreciate." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I understand how it might have looked from your perspective. Not every valuable innovation comes in a polished package." A flicker of genuine humility crossed Mr. Peterson's face. "Yes, well, that's a lesson I'm learning today. If there's anything Westview can do to support your work going forward, please don't hesitate to ask." "I appreciate that," Thomas replied, surprised to find he harbored no resentment. Yesterday's dismissal seemed distant and unimportant in the face of today's validation. As the conversation continued, the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors became audible in the distance, growing steadily louder until all eyes turned skyward. A sleek black helicopter with the NASA insignia on its side appeared over the tree line, circling once before beginning its descent toward the school's baseball field. "Our transportation has arrived," Dr. Martinez noted casually, as though the appearance of a NASA helicopter at a rural high school were an everyday occurrence. "We were scheduled to visit a research facility about 60 miles from here this afternoon. When we arranged to meet with you, we asked our pilot to include Oakridge in the itinerary. The entire school had now emptied onto the grounds, students and teachers alike watching in disbelief as the helicopter touched down on the baseball diamond. The sight was so incongruous, so completely outside the normal rhythm of life at Oakridge High, that many simply stood with mouths agape. Principal Evans looked as though he might faint from excitement. "This is unprecedented in the history of our school," he kept repeating, pulling out his phone to document the moment. Dr. Martinez turned to Thomas one last time before they departed. "We'll be in touch very soon, with formal documentation and arrangements for both the farm visit and the symposium. In the meantime, keep developing your ideas, Thomas. What you've created here isn't just a clever device. It's a new way of thinking, about accessibility and innovation that has implications far beyond agriculture." She handed him her business card, a simple NASA logo embossed on heavy cardstock. "Feel free to email me directly with any questions. And please thank your father again for bringing your system here today. We're very much looking forward to seeing it in its working environment." As the NASA team made their way toward the waiting helicopter, the crowd of students parted to let them pass. Thomas stood beside his satellite tracker, still trying to process the dramatic shift in his reality. 24 hours ago, he had been dismissed and mocked at Westview Academy, his work deemed unworthy of serious consideration. Now, NASA engineers were boarding a helicopter on his school's baseball field after inviting him to present at Johnson Space Center. Robert Miller moved to stand beside his son, placing a hand on his shoulder as they watched the helicopter lift off. "You were right to believe in your work," he said quietly, "and I was wrong to doubt it could go beyond our farm." Thomas shook his head. "You weren't wrong, Dad. You just wanted to protect me from disappointment. But you also gave me the tools and space to try anyway, and that made all the difference." As the helicopter disappeared over the horizon, students began to approach Thomas with newfound respect and curiosity, asking questions about his satellite tracker and how it worked. Even those who had previously viewed his obsession with satellites as odd or irrelevant now looked at his creation with genuine interest. Mr. Jenkins made his way through the crowd to Thomas's side, beaming with pride. "I always knew your project was special," the science teacher said, "but I never imagined it would lead to this. NASA Johnson Space Center. This is beyond anything I could have hoped for when I encouraged you to enter that competition." Thomas smiled, the validation warming him more deeply than he had expected. "Thank you for believing in my project, Mr. Jenkins. You were the only one at school who really understood what I was trying to accomplish. Not the only one now, Mr. Jenkins replied, gesturing to the crowd of fascinated students surrounding the satellite tracker. I think Oakridge High just got a powerful lesson in what innovation really looks like. Principal Evans was already on his phone, likely calling local media outlets to report on NASA's unprecedented visit to their small rural school. Nearby, Mr. Peterson stood watching the scene with a thoughtful expression, perhaps reconsidering some of his assumptions about what constituted valuable scientific innovation. As the excitement continued to swirl around him, Thomas felt a strange sense of calm certainty. The path forward wasn't entirely clear. Presentations at Johnson Space Center and potential collaboration with NASA engineers were far beyond anything he had imagined when building his tracker in the family barn. But he knew now that his approach to problem solving, his willingness to work within constraints rather than being limited by them, had value beyond what he had originally envisioned. The satellite dish rotated slowly, continuing to track its target across the clear blue sky, a simple machine built from discarded parts that had somehow connected Oakridge to NASA and opened doors that had seemed permanently closed to a farm boy with big ideas. In that moment, Thomas understood that innovation wasn't defined by where it happened or who created it, but by its impact on real-world problems, a lesson that neither failure nor success could diminish. The news of NASA's visit to Oakridge spread through the community with astonishing speed. By the time school dismissed that afternoon, local reporters had gathered outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the helicopter or interview students who had witnessed the extraordinary events. Thomas found himself at the center of a whirlwind of attention. His satellite tracker suddenly transformed from a peculiar hobby into a celebrated innovation. "I heard they're taking your invention to space," said a wide-eyed seventh grader who approached Thomas in the hallway, one of many younger students who now looked at him with undisguised awe. "Not exactly," Thomas explained patiently. "They're interested in how the tracking system could help farmers in developing countries get access to satellite data." Principal Evans seemed determined to maximize the publicity value of NASA's visit, arranging an impromptu assembly where Thomas was asked to explain his project to the entire student body. Standing on the auditorium stage, Thomas felt a strange reversal from the previous day's humiliation at Westview. The same project that had drawn mockery and dismissal was now being presented as a source of pride for the entire school. "As many of you know," Principal Evans announced to the packed auditorium, "NASA's Rural Technology Initiative has recognized the innovative work of our own Thomas Miller. His satellite tracking system, developed right here at Oakridge, will be presented at the Johnson Space Center next month." The applause was genuine, but tinged with a surrealism that wasn't lost on Thomas. Many of these same students had previously viewed his obsession with satellites as odd or irrelevant. Now they cheered as though they'd supported him all along. When Thomas took the microphone, he decided to focus not on the validation from NASA, but on the problem his tracker was designed to solve. "The reason I built this system wasn't to win competitions or get recognition," he explained. "It was because small farmers like my family need access to the same data that large agricultural corporations use to maximize their efficiency and productivity. The satellite information exists, but the systems to access it cost far more than most family farms can afford." As he demonstrated how his tracker worked, explaining the technical challenges and solutions in terms his fellow students could understand, Thomas noticed a shift in their attention. This wasn't just about the NASA helicopter or the excitement of external validation. Many were genuinely interested in how technology could address practical problems in their agricultural community. The system costs less than $200 to build using salvaged parts, Thomas concluded. That means it's accessible to virtually any farmer who needs it, And while it might not look as impressive as commercial systems, it provides 98% of the functionality at a fraction of the cost. After school, Thomas returned home to find several neighbors' trucks parked in the farm's driveway. Word had spread beyond the school, and local farmers had come to see the satellite tracker that had attracted NASA's attention. Robert Miller was already in the barn, proudly showing off his son's creation to a group of interested neighbors. "Thomas, show the Hendersons how your system tracks that weather satellite," his father called as Thomas entered. Jim's been asking about the soil moisture readings for his south field. For the next hour, Thomas demonstrated his tracker to people who immediately grasped its practical value. Unlike the Westview judges, these farmers didn't care about the system's appearance or how it compared to theoretical academic standards. They wanted to know if it worked, how much it cost to build, and whether it could help them make better decisions about irrigation, planting, and harvesting. "Could you build one of these for my place?" asked Jim Henderson, a weather-beaten man who farmed 500 acres of wheat and corn. "I've been looking at those commercial systems, but they want $5,000 just for the basic package, plus a monthly subscription fee." "I'd be happy to help you build one," Thomas replied, surprised by the request. "Most of the parts can be salvaged or purchased affordably, and I could share the software I developed." By evening, 3 other farmers had expressed interest in building their own trackers with Thomas's guidance. What had begun as a personal project to help his family was evolving into something that could benefit the entire farming community. When Thomas finally had a moment alone with his parents at dinner, he felt overwhelmed by the day's events. "It doesn't seem real," he admitted, pushing peas around his plate. "Yesterday, Mr. Peterson was telling me to leave satellite technology to NASA. Today, NASA is inviting me to present at Johnson Space Center, and local farmers want me to help them build their own trackers." Sarah Miller reached across the table to squeeze her son's hand. "What's happening now is simply the world catching up to what we already knew. You've created something valuable, Thomas." "Your mother's right," Robert added. "NASA recognized the value in your work because Dr. Williams knew what to look for. The farmers recognize it because they understand the problem you're solving. Mr. Peterson couldn't see it because he was blinded by his own expectations about what innovation should look like." Thomas nodded, considering his father's insight. Dr. Martinez said something similar. She said NASA's Rural Technology Initiative was specifically created to identify innovations that emerge from non-traditional sources because people who understand real-world constraints firsthand often develop solutions that professional engineers might overlook. "Smart woman," Robert commented, refilling his water glass. "Now the question is, what happens next? This NASA symposium could open doors you haven't even considered yet." That question lingered in Thomas's mind as he prepared for bed. His phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from classmates, questions from local farmers, and follow-up. Emails from Dr. Martinez with details about the upcoming symposium and farm visit. One message, however, stood out. An email from Michael Anderson, the Westview student whose quantum computing project had won first place at the competition. "I heard about NASA visiting your school today," Michael's message began. "Pretty impressive. I've been thinking about what you said regarding innovation solving real problems, not just demonstrating advanced technology. Would you be open to talking sometime? I've got some ideas about applying quantum algorithms to agricultural data analysis that might complement your tracking system." Thomas read the email twice, surprised by both its respectful tone and the genuine interest it expressed. Yesterday, Michael had mockingly called him farm boy and dismissed his tracker as cute in a retro way. Today, he was proposing a collaboration. The power dynamics had shifted dramatically in 24 hours. After a moment's consideration, Thomas composed a polite response, agreeing to meet with Michael the following weekend. If NASA saw value in bridging different perspectives on technology, perhaps there was potential in connecting Michael's advanced computing expertise with Thomas's practical approach to agricultural data. The next morning, Thomas woke early as usual. Farm chores didn't wait, even for students who had been recognized by NASA. As he fed the livestock before school, he noticed his father in the south field, examining a section of crops that had been showing signs of stress. "The soil moisture data from your tracker was right," Robert called as Thomas approached. "There's a drainage issue developing here that isn't visible on the surface yet. If we address it now, we might save this entire section." Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction at this practical validation of his work. While NASA's recognition was extraordinary, this was what he had built the tracker for, helping his family farm more efficiently with information they couldn't otherwise afford to access. At school, Thomas found a different atmosphere awaiting him. Teachers who had previously paid little attention to his academic interests now engaged him in conversations about satellite technology and data analysis. Fellow students who had never shown interest in his project approached with questions and congratulations. Even the principal treated him with a new deference, as though his NASA connection had elevated his status within the school hierarchy. "The local newspaper wants to interview you during lunch period," Principal Evans informed him between classes. "And the superintendent called this morning to discuss creating a special STEM Innovation Award inspired by your accomplishment." Thomas accepted these developments with a mixture of appreciation and wariness. While the recognition was gratifying, he couldn't help noticing how quickly institutional attitudes could change based on external validation. The same system that had never particularly valued his interests or approach was now eager to claim association with his success. During physics class, Mr. Jenkins pulled him aside with news that further highlighted this institutional shift. "Westview Academy called this morning," the science teacher said quietly. "They're inviting you to present your satellite tracker at their upcoming technology symposium. Apparently, they want to feature innovations that approach scientific challenges from diverse perspectives." Thomas couldn't suppress a small laugh. "Yesterday, my project was dismissed as a 4-H project. Today, it represents diverse perspectives." Mr. Jenkins smiled knowingly. "Amazing how quickly perspectives can evolve when NASA helicopters are involved." He hesitated, then added, "You don't have to accept, of course. After how they treated you at the competition, no one would blame you for declining." Thomas considered this for a moment. His first instinct was indeed to refuse. Why give Westview the satisfaction of associating themselves with his project now that it had received external validation? But as he thought about it, he recognized an opportunity. "I think I'll accept," he decided. "Not for Westview's benefit, but because it might help other students like me, kids with good ideas who don't fit the traditional mold of what science or innovation is supposed to look like." Mr. Jenkins nodded approvingly. "That's very mature, Thomas, using your newfound platform to create space for others rather than settling scores." The remainder of the week passed in a whirlwind of activity. Local media ran features on the Oakridge farm boy who impressed NASA, complete with photos of Thomas with his satellite tracker and quotes from Dr. Martinez about the Rural Technology Initiative. Farmers from neighboring counties began calling to inquire about building their own tracking systems, leading Robert to suggest converting part of their barn into a small workshop where Thomas could help others replicate his design. On Friday afternoon, Dr. Martinez called to confirm that she and her team would visit the Miller farm the following Wednesday to see the satellite tracker operating in its intended environment. We're particularly interested in observing how you've integrated the system into your actual farming operations, she explained. The practical application is what sets your approach apart from theoretical solutions. Saturday brought another unexpected development when Michael Anderson arrived at the Miller farm in his father's luxury SUV, looking distinctly out of place amid the working agricultural equipment. Despite the awkwardness of their previous interactions, Thomas found Michael genuinely interested in understanding the practical challenges that had shaped the tracker's design. "I've been thinking about our approaches," Michael said, as they examined the satellite tracker in the barn. "My quantum computing project is theoretically impressive, but has no immediate practical application. Your tracker solves a real problem. Right now, even if the technology isn't cutting edge by academic standards." Thomas appreciated the frank assessment. Different goals require different approaches. Your quantum computing work could lead to breakthroughs that haven't even been imagined yet. "Maybe," Michael conceded, "but I've been wondering if there's a middle ground. What if we combined your practical understanding of agricultural data needs with more advanced processing capabilities?" This led to a productive discussion about potential collaborations. Michael's expertise in algorithm development could potentially enhance the tracker's data processing capabilities, while Thomas's practical knowledge of agricultural needs could give purpose and direction to Michael's theoretical work. By the end of their meeting, they had outlined a joint project, adapting quantum-inspired algorithms to analyze agricultural satellite data more efficiently, potentially increasing the tracker's capabilities without significantly raising its cost. It was an unexpected partnership, bridging the gap between theoretical academic innovation and practical problem-solving. As Michael prepared to leave, he hesitated by his car. "I want to apologize for how I acted at the competition," he said, meeting Thomas's eyes directly. "I was arrogant and dismissive of your work because it didn't fit my idea of what serious innovation looks like." "We all have our biases and blind spots," Thomas replied, genuinely moved by the apology. "What matters is being willing to reconsider them when confronted with new information." The following Wednesday, the Miller farm became the center of attention once again as a NASA team arrived, this time by SUV rather than helicopter, to observe Thomas's satellite tracker in its working environment. Dr. Martinez, Dr. Wilson, and Dr. Patel spent hours exploring how the Miller family had integrated satellite data into their farming operations, from irrigation decisions to planting schedules. "What's particularly valuable about your approach," Dr. Wilson observed as they walked the fields, "is how you've prioritized the specific data points that matter most for day-to-day agricultural decisions. Commercial systems often provide an overwhelming amount of information without distinguishing what's immediately actionable." Dr. Patel nodded in agreement. "And your interface design makes the information accessible to users without specialized training. That's crucial for the developing regions we're targeting with our initiative." The visit concluded with a discussion about how Thomas's design principles might be adapted for the NASA Symposium presentation. Rather than simply showcasing the tracker itself, Dr. Martinez suggested framing it within a broader context of democratizing access to satellite technology. "Your innovation isn't just a device," she explained. "It's an approach to problem-solving that challenges conventional assumptions about who can create technology and how it should be developed. That perspective is as valuable to our work as the specific technical solutions you've created." As the NASA team prepared to depart, Dr. Martinez handed Thomas a folder containing official documentation for the symposium, including travel arrangements for him and his father to visit Johnson Space Center the following month. We've also included information about our internship program, she added. We believe you would be an excellent candidate for next summer if you're interested. The program pairs innovators with our engineering teams to develop practical applications of space technology for Earth-based challenges. Thomas accepted the folder with a sense of surreal gratitude. 6 months ago, the idea of NASA internships had seemed as distant and inaccessible as the satellites his tracker followed across the sky. Now it was a tangible possibility, one path among several that had suddenly opened before him. That evening, as the Miller family discussed these new opportunities over dinner, Thomas found himself reflecting on the dramatic shift in his circumstances. "It's strange," he said. "Nothing about my tracker has changed since the Westview competition. It's exactly the same device that Mr. Peterson dismissed as a 4H project. The only thing that's different is who's evaluating it and what standards they're using." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "That's an important lesson, son. Value isn't inherent in the thing itself. It's determined by whether people recognize its usefulness for their needs. NASA sees possibilities in your approach that Westview couldn't imagine because they're looking for different qualities." "I keep thinking about other students like me," Thomas continued. "Kids with ideas that don't fit the traditional model of what innovation is supposed to look like. How many potential solutions are we missing because we have such a narrow definition of what constitutes valuable scientific contribution?" Sarah smiled at her son's philosophical turn. "Perhaps that's something you can address in your NASA presentation. Use your platform to advocate for a broader understanding of innovation." The suggestion resonated with Thomas, crystallizing thoughts that had been forming since Dr. Martinez's first email. His experience, the dismissal at Westview, followed by recognition from NASA, illustrated a broader pattern in how innovation was evaluated and valued. The institutions that served as gatekeepers often failed to recognize solutions that emerged from non-traditional sources or approaches, potentially overlooking valuable contributions that didn't fit established expectations. In the weeks leading up to the NASA symposium, Thomas divided his time between preparing his presentation, helping local farmers build their own satellite trackers, and developing the collaborative project with Michael. Each of these activities reinforced his evolving understanding of innovation as a process that thrived at the intersection of different perspectives and approaches. The growing community of farmers using his tracking system provided continual feedback that helped refine and improve the design. Collaboration with Michael pushed Thomas to consider how more advanced processing techniques could enhance the system's capabilities without compromising its accessibility. And preparation for the NASA presentation forced him to articulate the principles underlying his approach to problem solving. 2 days before Thomas and his father were scheduled to depart for Johnson Space Center, Thomas received a surprise visit from Mr. Peterson. The Westview science director arrived at the Miller farm unannounced, clearly uncomfortable as he stood in the driveway beside his polished sedan. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said when Thomas came out to greet him. "I wanted to speak with you before your NASA presentation." Thomas invited him into the barn where the original satellite tracker was still set up, now surrounded by components for several similar systems being built for neighboring farms. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since NASA's visit to your school," Mr. Peterson admitted, studying the tracker with new eyes. "I've taught science for 22 years, judged countless competitions, and mentored students who have gone on to prestigious universities, yet I completely failed to recognize the value in your work." Thomas remained silent, allowing the teacher to continue his reflection. "I've always believed I was encouraging innovation," Mr. Peterson continued, "but I now realize I've been constrained by a very narrow definition of what that means. I was evaluating your project against standards that prioritize theoretical sophistication and technological complexity over practical problem-solving and accessibility. We all have our biases, Thomas replied, echoing what he had told Michael. They shape what we see and value, Mr. Peterson nodded. Indeed, but as educators, our biases can have significant consequences for our students. How many promising ideas have I dismissed over the years because they didn't conform to my expectations of what serious science looks like? The question hung in the air between them, both rhetorical and profound in its implications. I've proposed changes to how we structure the Westview science competition, Mr. Peterson continued after a moment, including new categories that specifically recognize innovations addressing practical challenges with accessible solutions. It's a small step, but perhaps it will help create space for approaches like yours that might otherwise be overlooked. Thomas was genuinely moved by this development. The easy response would have been satisfaction at seeing Mr. Peterson humbled by events, but Thomas found himself appreciating the teacher's willingness to reconsider long-held assumptions. That could make a real difference for students with unconventional ideas, he said. Thank you for being open to that change. As Mr. Peterson prepared to leave, he hesitated, then extended his hand. I wish you the best at the NASA Symposium, Thomas. You've taught me an important lesson about innovation, and I suspect you'll continue to challenge assumptions wherever you go. The Monday morning departure for Johnson Space Center arrived with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. The Miller family gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, Robert and Thomas loading their bags into Sarah's car for the drive to the regional airport, where their NASA-arranged flight awaited. I'm so proud of you, Sarah said, embracing her son before they departed. Not just for the recognition or the invention itself, but for how you've handled everything, the dismissal at Westview, the sudden attention, all of it. You've stayed true to who you are and what matters. Thomas hugged his mother tightly, grateful for her unwavering support through his journey from curious farm boy to NASA-recognized innovator. I'll call when we land, he promised. As Sarah's car disappeared down the long driveway, Thomas took one last look at the family farm spread out before him in the early morning light. The fields his family had tended for generations, the barn where his satellite tracker had first taken shape, the small workshop now expanding to help other farmers build their own systems, all of it a reminder of where his innovation had begun and why it mattered. The sun was just beginning to illuminate the eastern horizon as they drove away, its light catching the satellite dish Thomas had mounted on the barn roof months earlier. The dish rotated slowly, tracking an invisible point moving across the gradually brightening sky, a simple machine built from discarded parts that had somehow connected rural Oakridge to the cutting-edge work at NASA and opened doors that had seemed permanently closed to a farm boy with big ideas. As they merged onto the highway heading toward the airport, Thomas found himself thinking not just about the presentation ahead or the potential opportunities at Johnson Space Center, but about the broader implications of his experience. Innovation could emerge from unexpected places when people with first-hand understanding of problems were empowered to develop solutions. Sometimes the most valuable contributions came not from those with the most resources or prestigious credentials, but from those who saw possibilities where others saw only limitations. The road stretched before them, leading away from the familiar fields of Oakridge toward a future newly expanded with possibility. Whatever happened at the NASA Symposium or beyond, Thomas knew that his understanding of innovation had been permanently transformed. It wasn't defined by where it happened or who created it, but by its impact on real-world problems, a lesson that neither failure nor success could diminish. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If This one hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.